Hello and welcome to another OmniFocus Fitness video. Today we're going to be discussing how muscles produce force. We are going to go into the physiology of how muscles produce force. First, we're going to cover what is force in very basic terms. Then we're going to figure out how our muscles, from a large scale all the way down to a cellular scale and even subcellular scale, how our muscles are able to create force via tension, via contraction, via, well, basically energy. And then we will also cover how the body creates maximal and submaximal force production. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. However, as usual, these videos tend to be quite long, so there's a menu system provided so you can skip to different sections of the video, and that menu system will show up after this introduction. Hopefully you're having a good day, and I will see you on the other side. Let's get started. First things first, we need an operational definition. What is force? Force is, if you want to look at it from a physiological standpoint, a weightlifting standpoint, exercise standpoint, movement standpoint, we can look at force synonymously as power. If you want an even better definition, then it is basically the energy needed to enact change. If you want an even better definition for what we're going to be talking about, specifically muscles and physiology, then the energy needed to enact movement. This right here, this is movement, and it requires a certain amount of force, and it requires our muscles to go through several different changes. So, without further ado, let's try and discuss those changes. Okay, so this is the kind of thing that probably it would be better if I had a visual for it. So therefore, we're going to go ahead and skip to the Blackboard method, and there I will explain this section in detail. So let's go ahead and do that. Alrighty, so moving on. We just understood how or what force is. Now we're going to actually understand how our muscles produce force. And to do that, as usual, I don't like to just jump straight into it, because if you are a complete beginner, then honestly some of these illustrations might be a bit confusing. So let's move on from the outside and let's go in. So from a macro perspective, again, we will move inwards. And we're going to cover how tension is created and how that applies to force, as well as something called the all or none principle. And we'll go over just a smidgen of muscle anatomy, just enough so you understand how these contractions happen and how that force is then created through those contractions. So let's go ahead and start. The first thing that I want to quick point out is this is our body. So let's start right here. We've got obviously a human being, and they don't have their skin. Shame for them. But if you pick any point where a person has muscle, so let's say we look at, just take a small segment like that, and you can see how this is kind of striated. I don't know if you've ever heard of that term, but the term striation comes from these lines that protrude from the muscle or are created by the muscle. And if we were to zoom in, right, if we were to zoom in, we would end up with this. And this is, you can kind of tell where that striation comes from. And this is kind of a muscle belly, if you will. This is probably more like the tendon would be located right here, and it would go through and be pretty long. The same thing could be true of really any point. So if we take an arm, I like using the arms because I think it's just generally a good example. So if we focus on, let's say, the arm and we zoom in, we get a similar picture. So let's move over here. We're zooming into the arm muscle, the bicep, and we see this. So this is kind of basic muscle anatomy here. You're kind of looking at the muscle belly, and then within each muscle belly there's all kinds of different things, but we keep zooming in, and here we're going to end up with a muscle fiber. So this would be a muscle fiber or a muscle cell. Same thing. Then if we actually zoom in further into the muscle fiber and just focus on these little round portions right here, that is actually displayed right here. So this thing right here, a myofibril, which is kind of just a very long protein that's found within the muscle fiber, so within the muscle cell. The myofibril is made up of many of these sarcomeres. So these sarcomeres are chained together kind of to make up a very long myofibril. We don't really care about the myofibril itself. We're not going to talk about it too much, nor are we going to talk about the myocyte, the actual muscle fiber, where we are more concerned with what happens within each one of these sarcomeres. So again, we're talking about within one muscle belly, we go right here, and we keep zooming in, and this is obviously broken up into different compartments. We eventually get to a muscle cell, and then within that muscle cell, there are myofibrils, which are just long proteins. And then we're just going to focus on what each segment of that myofibril does. And each segment of that myofibril is broken up into something called a sarcomere. So how does that apply? How does that apply to force production? Well, it applies because each sarcomere has a finite amount of space, and that finite amount of space is defined by something called a Z-disc. So the Z-disc is the end of the sarcomere. This is a Z-disc, so this is the end of the sarcomere, and that's the end of the sarcomere, and this is also a sarcomere, and it would end over here, and then so on and so forth, making the rest of this myofibril. And the reason why that's important is because this section right here is called the myosin-actin chain. I'm not going to go a whole lot into detail with it. You can obviously read my muscle contraction article, and I will hopefully make a video related to that, and I will go far more into detail with all the anatomy of the actual myofibril and the muscle cell and the sarcomere, etc., etc. But we're not so concerned about that right now. Really, all you need to know is when a muscle contracts, what it does is it moves this myosin, which is this red portion here, along the actin. So the actin is right here, the myosin is right here, and you can see these kind of springs, these kind of coils. Well, what it does is it will move, when it's contracting, it will move the actual myosin towards the Z-disc. And the reason why I mentioned that a Z-disc defines a sarcomere and gives it a limited amount of space is because it allows it to either fully contract or not contract at all. So these springs, if you will, is a very simplistic way of looking at it, these springs actually pull inwards towards the Z-discs, which pulls and creates tension, because just think about it, if you were to hold, let's say, a rubber band, between both of your hands and you were to pull on it, you would create more tension. There would be energy there. You'd be creating energy by putting tension on the band. That's exactly what you're doing here. In this case, the myosin head eventually then ends up at the Z disc because the Z disc moves closer to the actual myosin head. And then you've got a contracted sarcomere. And I will go into that a little bit in just a second. So just so you know, you're creating tension by moving the Z disc to the myosin head. And if this occurs across every single sarcomere in a myofibril, then that means that myofibril is then contracting, which if enough of those contract, then that means that the muscle cell will be contracting, and so on and so forth. So then you can apply that up here and then move it to the whole muscle belly, and then eventually you will understand the kind of waterfall cascading effect that you have when you innervate these muscle proteins, these very small muscle proteins. If they contract, then they each have an impact on every single other larger body that is made up of those proteins, and eventually you actually feel that in your muscle when, let's say, this guy's doing, let's say, bicep curls, or right now it seems like he's flexing. So let's go into that a little bit with a little bit more detail, and hopefully you'll get a little bit better visual. Okay, so basically the same picture, but we're going to be focusing on the sarcomere in this instance. So really, the contraction is based around 3 different phases. The first phase is called the latent phase. And the latent phase is a dormant state. It is a state in which the actual sarcomere does not move. Okay, so this is right here a perfect example of the latent stage. You'll have to excuse the control there. I don't know what's going on with that. So this is the latent stage right here. You don't have any movement across the Z discs. These springs are relatively relaxed. They're just hanging out. This is the state that it would be in if it were completely relaxed. Then, and in this stage, the body's actually preparing, is in a preparatory stage for actual contraction, but it is not contracting at this point. Then, next is something called the contraction phase, which I'm sure you can probably guess what that means. Yeah, you do have a contraction across the sarcomere. And again, as I've already explained, that means that the Z disc is going to be moving towards the myosin, which is this red part. So the myosin kind of walk across this actin, and the Z discs eventually move closer to the myosin until they are right there up against it. And if you'll look over here, that's exactly what we see here. You see these springs here are no longer as visible because they're being cramped in. There's a lot of tension. You've got a bunch of tension right here pulling these Z discs closer to the myosin head. Basically, they're almost touching. And that's what leads to a full contraction. Now, I kind of want to touch on this a little bit more and explain the all or none principle, which is kind of something I quick mentioned at the beginning of this part. So if we're talking about the all or none principle, we're talking about the fact that muscle fibers and the sarcomere in general cannot contract partially. It must contract fully. There's either a full contraction or zero contraction. You cannot have a gradated contraction. You cannot have 80%, 60%, 50%, 30%. It doesn't matter. You can only have zero, where it is not innervated, it is not activated, and therefore it does not end up in this contraction phase. Or you have it innervated, you have it activated, and it ends up in this contraction phase right here, which means that the myosin head is basically touching against the Z-disc, which means the sarcomere has been contracted. And at that point, you are basically putting yourself in an energetic state to a point where you can create force. You're now creating force, you're creating power because you are in an energetic state. And I will address that a little bit in the next section as well, because that should raise the question of, well, how do muscles produce a maximal, which we understand, okay, maximal shouldn't be an issue. If you have 100% contraction, then you're doing a maximal contraction. You're doing a maximal lift, for example. But how does the body then create a submaximal system? So let's say you want to pick up a pencil or you want to pick up a spoon. You don't want to be picking up a spoon at 100% power all the time because, well, I mean, the spoon's just going to fly out of your hand. You're using way too much power for that. So we'll address that a little bit later. But that kind of conflicts with the whole idea of the all or none principle of contraction, of having that myosin head move against that Z-disc and have a fully contracted sarcomere right here. Now, the last stage is called the relaxation phase, which, wow, I mean, brilliant titling. But really, in this case, we see we move from this contraction phase with these springs or these coils being cramped up and the myosin being right up to the Z-disc, and we see the myosin then move back to its original starting position. So, and that's really it. I mean, there isn't much else to it. It just moves back to its original starting position, at its original starting position, which, as we know, is the latent phase. That is where it is now ready again to fire again. But that actual movement of the Z-disc away from the myosin head means that you are going through a relaxation phase. And I know I'm explaining these things, and they seem relatively simple, but really these things happen extremely quickly. I mean, we're talking about milliseconds. And this happens continuously. I mean, throughout your entire system, throughout your entire body. And that's exactly what I wanted to hammer down in your head, is if we move here, I mean, you can pick any spot on your body. I mean, any muscle on your body, and it's the exact same system. It's the exact same way that your body contracts. 100% contraction or 0% contraction. Are you activating it or are you not activating it? That is the only question that crosses the body's system. And that's how it reacts. So, creating that tension, just a quick go over it again, creating that tension over here with these Z-discs against the myosin creates an energetic state in which then, as we know, creates energy to enact change, energy to enact movement. Specifically, in this case, when we're talking about muscles, we now have the energy to enact movement. And when we do that, then we release that energy and we go into our relaxation phase, where we move back to our standard situation with these coils relaxed, the Z-discs back into their original position, and the myosin head, or the myosin in general, just being right back in the middle of the sarcomere. Hopefully that made sense. I really hope it did. But anyways, that brings up that question of how do the muscles then produce maximal and submaximal efforts, and we will go into that next. So, now that we're back, after that section, you should have the question of if the muscle fibers are going through an all or none principle of either contracting 100% of the way or contracting 0% of the way, how does the body differentiate between creating enough force for, let's say, lifting my phone? I'm lifting my phone, doesn't require a whole lot of force, as opposed to a 1 rep max for the squat. How does the body differentiate between those two. If muscle fibers are activated, when they are activated, they contract maximally, 100%. So that's a massive amount of force. Well, the body does this through a kind of odd, unique way of gradation. And there are two different systems that it uses to actually do that. One is recruitment. So the number of muscle fibers recruited allows the body to figure out how many muscle fibers it needs for a particular amount of force. So again, if I were to pick up my cell phone, that requires, let's say, 20 muscle fibers. So the body will then activate those 20 muscle fibers to allow me to have enough force to move or enact change on my cellular device. Wow, that sounded nerdy. Cellular device. Okay. Anyways, moving on. So then if I were to do something like a 1 rep max on a squat, and I need maximal amount, of course, obviously, this is going to be a max exertion. It's going to be a whole lot of force that I need. In that case, then the body will innervate and activate thousands, millions of fibers. Obviously, the comparison isn't exactly proportional. Let's say 10,000 fibers, but it's going to activate almost all, if not all, of the fibers necessary for my body to then be able to lift that squat back up from the hole. So that is one system that the body uses, being able to gradate by the number of actual muscle fibers innervated or activated. Another system is summation, and really a better way of going about saying that is summation through frequency. So the amount of times, and I believe I went over how to distinguish between the latency period, the contraction period, and the relaxation phase. Well, if we go a step further with that, when the body innervates the muscle fiber, and which activates the myofibril, which activates the sarcomere, which activates contraction, etc., etc. When it goes through that system, the muscle is contracting and relaxing, contracting and relaxing, contracting and relaxing. Well, we can put ourselves in a position where we actually contract more often. So while the contraction itself will be maximal at all times, we can actually contract it more often. So instead of contracting and relaxing, contracting and relaxing, what it's going to end up doing, if we want more summation, we want more frequency, it will contract, relax, contract, relax, contract, relax. So it doesn't allow it to fully relax. It actually contracts as quickly as it possibly can. And at a certain point, it eventually realizes this state called tetanus. And tetanus is kind of like when you think of tetanus, the disease state where your body's locked up, right? You got lockjaw, for example. It's a little bit like that. It's actually a lot like that. Your body's contracting and relaxing so quickly that eventually it's just contracting, 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 holding on as tightly as it possibly can. And eventually fatigue sets in and the body's then forced to relax. That would be summation of frequency. So the frequency goes from, let's say, picking up my cell phone. Let's go ahead, my cellular device. If I pick up my cellular device, it's just a slow frequency. Contract, relax. Contract, relax. It doesn't take much frequency. It doesn't take much summation. But on the other hand, if I were to do a maximal squat, again, in that case, my body's going to be going contract, relax, contract, relax, contract, relax, keep going, go, 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 and then eventually it's just going to hold as much as it possibly can. And then if fatigue sets in, and let's say I hit failure, it just relaxes. And I can't do anything about that. The body just tried its absolute maximal most and could not sustain it. Fatigue set in and it was forced to relax back to its original state. With the myosin going back in the middle, the Freudian slip, I don't Z, and the Z discs going back to their original positions on further away from the myosin and letting that coil kind of uncoil again. So those are the two mechanisms, those are the two ways that the body is then able to gradate and differentiate between maximal and submaximal force production. This is the summary of the video for those of you that need a quick recap. If not, please subscribe and check out the attached article. Alrighty. In summary, what did we talk about? We talked about force and how that basically equals power in physiological terms. We talked about how force is the energy to enact movement. That's a very basic definition, and it is an applicable definition. Then we also talked about how force is created in the muscles, and that's through contraction, through tension created by the sarcomeres, by the myofibril, by the myofibrils within the muscle cells, and how the all or none principle, the 100% activation or no activation, there's no in between. Then that led to the question of how does the body create a submaximal force and maximal force? Maximal force makes sense simply by assuming that if our body's going to contract 0 or 100%, there's maximal force right there, 100% contraction. However, if we're talking about submaximal force, like picking up a pencil, picking up a cell phone, things like that, you're not going to want to just pick up your cell phone. It's not, everything doesn't have to be a jerky motion. In that case, of course, your body's going to go through two recruitment systems. And those are gradation systems, kind of unique gradation systems called recruitment and summation, and I call it summation by frequency. Recruitment talking about just the number of muscle fibers that are innervated, although each muscle fiber itself is innervated at 100% and contracting at 100%, the body can then decide how many of those muscle fibers are needed to produce enough force to then fulfill a task, fulfill a movement. And on the other hand, summation by frequency, which essentially states that if we were to look at a single muscle fiber or a group of muscle fibers, whatever it is, whatever grouping we want to look at, the number that we want to look at, we can also determine how many times within a period of time that grouping of muscle fibers or that single muscle fiber is activated. So within a minute, it could be activated once, or it could be activated 100 times. See, so the higher the frequency of activation, the more force production. And the peak level of force production is caused when we have such high frequency that the muscle is no longer able to relax. It is stuck in a rigid position, in a tense position, a contracted position, which then leads to what's called tetanus. And the body holds that position, a maximal effort, as much frequency of activation as possible until fatigue sets in, and it is then forced to let go or relax. So that's the video. If you found the information useful, please subscribe. Of course, more details and my sources are listed in the article below, as well as the article will pop up when the screen blacks out. So again, please subscribe if you found the information useful. It certainly motivates me to keep coming out with this content. And without further ado, I will let you go. Have a good one. See ya.